Well, welcome everybody. We'll go ahead and get started. I'm Thomas Kidd. I teach in the History Department, and I'm also a senior fellow with the Institute for Studies of Religion, which is sponsoring this symposium on the Civil War and religion today. So thank you all for coming out, and just so we don't forget, there's also a keynote address this afternoon at 3:30. By George Rabel, so if you have an opportunity, you'll want to attend that as well. I'm going to say a little bit more about the Institute this afternoon, but the Institute sponsors events like this that are of major interest on religion and various academic topics, not just history, of course. But it's not hard to understand why the Civil War is of great public interest, and especially this year because it's the 150th anniversary of the beginning of the Civil War this year, and so we decided to host this symposium on the role of faith in the American Civil War. So we're going to have a panel discussion, and to moderate the discussion we have Michael Parrish from the Department of History, who is the Lyndon Bowers Professor of American History and also helped me to organize the symposium. So, Mike, come on up.
Well, good morning, everyone. Thank you again for being here. We have a distinguished panel of speakers this morning. They are Amy Taylor, Robert Elder, Luke Harlow, Amy, Bob, Luke Harlow, and Professor John Boles of Rice. I'll introduce them separately, beginning with Amy, immediately before they talk. Amy Taylor is Associate Professor of History at the University of Albany, SUNY. She is the author of The Divided Family in the Civil War, published by the University of North Carolina Press. And she is writing a book on runaway slaves and Union refugee or contraband camps during the Civil War. Her paper today is titled A Wilderness of Suffering, Religion and Emancipation in the Civil War's Contraband Camps. Please welcome Amy Taylor.
Well, thank you, Mike, and thank you for the invitation to come down here. It's nice to be back in the South. Because despite one of the greatest typos I've seen in a long time, I'm not from SUNY, Alabama. I'll suggest to Andrew Cuomo that we open up another campus. But I want to begin today by talking about religion and slave emancipation. And I'm going to begin with a man named H.S. Boles, who was a missionary with the American Missionary Association, who traveled down to Portsmouth, Virginia. And when he arrived around November 1863, he was pretty surprised by what he found. A little girl approached him on the steps of the new school that he had helped establish for fugitive slaves and urged him to come see a 70-year-old woman lying nearby on a miserable pallet in a damp cellar who was partially paralyzed, deaf, and almost blind. I had never imagined a picture of such utter destitution, Boles wrote, until 1 week later, when two scarcely half-clothed children, one suffering from chronic dropsy, showed up at his door to take him to see their mother, who lay dying on a thing which could scarcely be called a bed. Boles continued to witness such scenes and wrote to AMA leaders back in New York that he once shared the clothing off his back with another mother and her 5 children, and that he often went home at night to wet my pillow with tears after these encounters. All of this led him to conclude that, quote, this transition state through which these people are passing is truly a wilderness of suffering. Now, what Boles saw is probably not the image that most of us have of the slave's journey from bondage to freedom in the midst of the Civil War. It's a far more triumphant story of policy decrees that arguably dominates our collective memory of slave emancipation. And although there is good reason for that, the day-to-day experience of the slave's journey to freedom reveals a far different and more difficult story. And one only has to look inside these contraband camps to see why. And let me stop for a moment and just clarify that when I talk about a contraband camp, what I'm talking about are over, by my count, about 130 settlements of refugee slaves who had fled their masters and sought protection in areas of Union occupation during the war. Altogether, 500,000 men, women, and children lived in these camps, and they confronted some of the most harrowing day-to-day conditions imaginable inside them. Well, Boles was not the only religious Northerner, that is, a missionary or representative of a church-based organization, who traveled south to assist the refugee slaves and noticed this situation. And most were likewise surprised by what they found. They had expected freedom to bring an end to suffering, since after all, many of them were former abolitionists, who throughout the antebellum period had pointed specifically to the physical suffering inflicted by slaveholders as a primary reason to abolish slavery. Freedom, they often preached, would guarantee slaves their basic human right to be free from bodily pain. But as life inside the war's contraband camps quickly made clear, this turned out not to be true, leaving these former abolitionists to ask some basic questions. How could they explain the presence of suffering in the life of an ex-slave? How come their long-promised freedom did not guarantee freedom from physical pain? Well, religious Northerners like H.S. Boles came up with some revealing answers to these questions, so today that's what I want to talk about. And I'm going to focus on two groups who were the most active in working with these fugitive slaves. One, the American Missionary Association, the largely Congregationalist group out of New York, and the Society of Friends, especially those coming from Philadelphia, New York, and Indiana. And from them, I think we can learn a lot about the way Americans, and especially Northerners, came to understand what was to them a previously unfamiliar process of ending slavery. They came to see it as something with a logic of its own beyond the stipulations of policy, as something directed by a higher power than Congress or the president. Most telling is their conclusion that in this process of becoming free, there existed a halfway point between slavery and freedom, a transition state of suffering, as Boles put it. This transition state, it has receded from our historical view over time. Few people know about what went on inside these contraband camps, but it's one that I'd argue I think demands full attention to really understand how slavery collapsed. Now, calling life inside the contraband camps a wilderness of suffering was really not much of an exaggeration. The severe physical hardship of those seeking freedoms at times amounted to a humanitarian crisis. And I can just give you some examples from the death rates alone. Take Hampton, Virginia in September 1862, where 7.5 people were dying each day. Helena, Arkansas in 1863, there were 1,100 people who died, or that was 25% of this refugee population in that year. The population of nearly 4,000 was reduced, as one report put it, by half in the same year in Natchez, Mississippi. They died from smallpox, yellow fever, malaria, pneumonia, measles, many other diseases that festered in conditions marked by too many people and too little sanitation. Those who managed to survive did so while crammed into tents, in log cabins without floors or proper ventilation, in barracks, which in Craney Island, Virginia, were built to house 100 people in a single room, or in Camp Barker in Washington, D.C., in structures that were 10 by 12 feet in dimension with as many as 26 people inside. And this was all after the refugees arrived at these camps with little more than clothing on their backs. The suffering among them no pen will be able to describe, wrote an AMA member in Virginia in September 1862, and yet the missionaries still tried. In letters and other dispatches to the North, they wrote of the deplorable condition of the refugees and referred to their lives as wretched, or as one Quaker woman put it, the most desolate and dismal scene I ever beheld. The single most commonly used term to describe the scene in the camps, though, was simply suffering. The refugees were referred to repeatedly as suffering humanity, poor suffering people, a tide of human suffering, this suffering class of the human family, and the list goes on. It was an instantly resonant term to Northern readers, and one that would have provoked a related question at the core of their Christian beliefs. How could the suffering be explained? Was it simply the result of slavery's long reach? Some answered yes, and observed, as a group of Philadelphia Friends did, how, quote, the body has been crippled by hard work and neglect in cruel bondage. They observed lacerations on backs, lost limbs and fingers, other permanent injuries inflicted by masters. Sights that led John Fee, an AMA missionary in Camp Nelson, Kentucky, to exclaim, quote, "Oh, the suffering incident to slavery. Today, as I looked upon the sick and dead, little ones, I was completely overcome and wept for the poor sufferers." Fee in effect extended the abolitionist critique of slavery's violence and pain into an explanation for what was happening during the war. But this cause-effect scenario did not satisfy all, and many others, while not denying the harmful long-term impact of slavery exactly, took note of the high death rates and rampant disease in the camps to argue that something different was now the cause of the pain. The advent of liberty, lamented an anonymous writer to The Friend in 1863, has plunged them thus far into a more deplorable state than before. An annual report of the New York Friends similarly contrasted the desolate condition in the camps with, quote, a more favorable one in slavery. What these writers saw happening in the war was qualitatively different from slavery, so if slavery could not be blamed as the source of the suffering, what or who could? This can be none other than the work of the Lord, was how the AMA's American Missionary Journal summed up what would be a widely invoked answer. It was suffering not necessarily inflicted by the sinful, the slaveholder, but suffering that this time around was directed and overseen by God. Here the missionaries joined many other Civil War Americans in invoking divine providence to explain much of the war's suffering, the soldiers' deaths, the rampant disease, the destitution of families left behind. As historians such as George Rabel, as we'll hear from this afternoon, have shown, Americans north and south, from soldiers to leaders, commonly saw God's hand in the bloodshed of war. To some, the war was punitive, his punishment for the sin of slavery, but to others, it was more purposeful, a deliverance from the nation's sins. Missionaries likewise viewed the suffering of ex-slaves and contraband camps within this providential framework, but they also turned to a more specific resource to guide them: the book of Exodus and its story of the Israelite journey out of slavery and into the Promised Land. This Old Testament story was a long invoked one by generations of the enslaved. It offered hope that one day their freedom would come. And during the war, comparisons of President Lincoln to Moses were beginning to become widespread. But there was another part of this story that to some missionaries had special significance for the people living in contraband camps. The children of Israel, AMA missionary Charles Wilder pointed out, quote, were 40 years at school in the wilderness before they were put upon the work of self-support. Similarly, the American missionary quoted a black minister in Hampton, Virginia, who took this one step further. It is said that God had set 200 years as the extent of the bondage of my people. We may even be obliged to pass 40 years more in a halfway wilderness state. According to these writings, life in the contraband camps could be viewed like the biblical wilderness state, a period of suffering on the way to the promised land of freedom. The Exodus story enabled missionaries to rationalize the suffering in contraband camps not only as new and different, but as a divinely ordained, distinct period between slavery and true freedom. The story helped explain the widespread suffering as something endemic to the emancipation process. It was to be expected. Or as H.S. Beals himself wrote, there is and must be so much suffering in this transition state. But perhaps more significantly, the analogy to the biblical wilderness also emphasized the temporary nature of the suffering. It would come to an end, and with faith, the ex-slaves would be delivered to the promised land of freedom. Their suffering was purposeful. But the idea that the contraband camps were like such a wilderness state surely would have cut against the hopes of some of these former abolitionists who had long believed that freedom should come immediately rather than gradually. And that may explain why one hears them searching for reassuring signals from the ex-slaves themselves. I have never before known such exemplification of contentment, wrote W.S. Bell, an AMA missionary in Virginia. In Bell's view, this had to be the legacy of slavery, since, quote, they suffered all their lives and have not yet become fully conscious that existence and suffering are not identical. Most others, though, while expressing similar awe at such contentment, or what another called unconquerable fortitude, attributed it to a higher cause. It does seem a pity that they should have to live in such a miserable style when they were anticipating so much, wrote two Quaker women. Still, they bear all, and many of them evince perfect trust in God. Likewise, Anne Schofield, who was working for the Friends in Yorktown, Virginia, she wrote home about a man named Baylor Pollard, who was a 60-year-old refugee who fled his plantation contracted an illness that lasted 3 months while he was working for the Union Army. And all the while, he was living apart from his family until he made a pretty difficult but successful trip to rescue them. This first year of his freedom was one of great distress, Schofield concluded. But through it all, he said he put his trust in the Lord and looked to him for help. And this was an oft-repeated scenario in their writings, leading one AMA missionary to conclude that, quote, they have strong faith in the Lord and are very patient in their sufferings. Such statements exuded a kind of awe at ex-slave fortitude that reminds one of similar sentiments once expressed by their masters. Where slaves were once content with slavery, as masters had long contended, they were now content with wartime suffering. Where once slaves were loyal to slaveholders, again in the master's telling, they were now loyal to God. Either way, there was a passive obedience in the depiction of the former slaves that, as a closer glance inside the camps reveals, stretches the imagination a bit. There's plenty of evidence of refugees becoming disillusioned and leaving these places. They went to other camps, trying a new place. They went to the north. In very rare cases, some went back to slavery. They were not always patient with the rampant disease and destitution around them. Yet the missionaries' depiction, however true, at least served the purpose of telling those back home that their work in the South was not in vain. The refugees were a people at once faithful but not too assertive. They could be led through the wilderness by the missionaries ready to help them. But how could they best be helped? We might be tempted to assume through teaching, religious instruction, and literacy, because it's already well known that the missionaries performed a great deal of important work in that area during the war. Yet this would miss a very different answer that emerged initially, through clothing. The sorely distressed fellow creatures, as an essay in The Friend argued, should be rescued, quote, first from perishing from want of clothing, while another Friend's report explained that, quote, at first our efforts were almost wholly directed to supplying clothing for the destitute. An AMA teacher in North Carolina simply stated that, quote, the first pressing need was for clothes. Clothing consumed so much of the missionaries' initial energy that one AMA member concluded that, quote, the giving out of clothing is the hardest task in our missionary life. This may be somewhat surprising. It's tempted to look at clothing as something that's kind of superficial, inconsequential in the past. But to overlook it in this instance would be to miss what was the acknowledged first and hardest missionary labor in the Civil War's contraband camps. However much the missionaries may have rationalized physical suffering as an act of divine providence, as something the refugees themselves could accept, they still expressed a great deal of revulsion at the ex-slaves' pain and made the task of relieving it their first priority as each camp formed. The physical necessities were to come before the mental ones. The missionaries even surprised themselves with the time they spent on clothing. During the past month, my time and strength have been devoted mainly to clothing the naked, reported Abisha Schofield, an AMA missionary in Kentucky in early 1865. Though it is not quite the labor I came here to do, he acknowledged, the way will thus be prepared for instruction. To Schofield, clothing was not only the most urgent, but so much else depended on it. Well-clothed people made for more attentive students, he suggested, while others claimed that the ex-slaves, quote, must be supplied before they are fit to be employed. Clothing would also prevent exposure, which in turn would control disease and bring about a more orderly environment. As one frustrated missionary put it, quote, how can it be expected I can inculcate order and cleanliness to beings with their feet sticking out of their shoes at all sides and their clothes in rags? But there was a more practical reason to seize on clothing, too. It was the one physical need not already met by the Army. The government issued food rations and helped construct shelters for refugees, but only provided clothing to select men on the Army's payroll. It was the Friends, unable to take up arms in the war, but eager, as one report put it, to show others the sincerity of our oft-repeated sympathy for the slaves, who took the lead in manufacturing clothing. And I won't go into much detail about this here in the interest of time, but workshops started to emerge in the cities where the Friends were, especially beginning in Philadelphia. Workshops where women in particular were sewing these clothes, and their production increased pretty quickly so that they were producing thousands of garments per month. As dresses, pantaloons, stockings, and pants made their way south in boxes and barrels, thanks in part to the Union Army's willingness to transport them at little to no cost, reports brought back glowing assessments of the clothing campaign's impact. Missionaries in the camps charged with distributing tickets that would then be redeemed for a suit of clothing or shoes wrote repeatedly of the thankfulness of the eager and grateful receivers. But even more, they stressed the clothing was transformative. Men, women, and children who had initially arrived in the camps naked, half-naked, unclothed, wretchedly clad, and there are many other terms that were used, they were now covered amply. There is a decidedly improved look already in the persons of the women and children, summed up an AMA missionary in Virginia. And with that outward transformation came an inward one too, a boost in morale, or in the words of one letter from Tennessee, the encouragement given them, quote, by distributing clothing among them. Altogether, according to a report from Craney Island, Virginia, the clothing, quote, has saved the people upon the island an immense amount of suffering. Any missionary eager to lead the refugees through their transition state of suffering saw progress on the bodies of the newly clothed, and clothing was especially useful in that regard. One can actually see in the replacement of the rags of the slave, as some put it, with sturdy Yankee-made attire, a measurable impact that other types of assistance did not always yield, or at least it wasn't visible. We might question just how transformative clothing really was. Were the fugitives really so naked in the first place? Or was this a useful rhetorical device to appeal to the Christian duty of those back home? And did the clothing really relieve or simply cover up the suffering? Well, such questions don't seem to have troubled the missionaries too much, and instead they embraced the notion that a transformation had indeed taken place. But for the clothing forwarded last year from this city, the Friends Freedmen's Association of Philadelphia concluded in 1864, quote, many human beings would have perished who are now in comfortable circumstances, supporting themselves, and grateful for the help which reached them in their time of need. Clothing not only saved lives, but they claimed also enabled recipients to make their way through the wilderness to achieve the most basic element of true freedom, self-sufficiency. Now, the precise logic of how clothing fostered self-support went unexplained, but the Friends did notably increasingly move clothing manufacturing out of the northern cities and into the camps and began paying refugees to sew garments. They also opened up stores in some places to sell clothing at below market costs rather than give it away. So one way or another, in the wearing, making, or buying of it, clothing, in the view of the missionaries, lifted ex-slaves out of suffering and enabled the coming of freedom. This would have reassured anyone concerned about creating permanent charity, to be sure, but more significantly, it appeared to validate the missionaries' larger understanding of the contraband camps as a transition state. To believe in clothing's transformative power was to believe that an endpoint to the refugees' suffering was in sight, that a way through the wilderness was near, and that the benevolent Christian North had the power to see them through this transitional journey. H.S. Beals, who opened this talk, summed up the missionaries' thinking in one of his more optimistic appeals for clothing in 1863. He said, quote, 1 year more, and we believe the untrammeled slave will go forth a freeman, to earn his bread by the sweat of his brow. But now, just now, we ask the alms of 500,000 Christians to sustain their tottering footsteps through the wilderness with Canaan just in view. And perhaps today, if we keep the wilderness in view, the suffering in the Civil War's contraband camps, we'll better see emancipation as it was experienced on a day-to-day basis, as protracted, chaotic, deadly, but ultimately hopeful. Thank you.
Thank you, Amy. Robert Elder is a Lilly postdoctoral fellow and lecturer in humanities at Valparaiso University, where he is revising his Emory University doctoral dissertation, which is a study of the connections between Southern honor culture and the rise of evangelicalism in the 18th and 19th century. His paper today is titled "The Prehistory of the Crusading Christian Confederate: Honor, Manhood, and Religion in the Civil War." Please welcome Robert Elder.
William.
To put out of the camera's view.
Okay. Need a straight shot here. I want to thank everybody at the Institute for giving me this opportunity. It's been great so far. I want to say quickly that I use the term myth throughout this paper to talk about this image of the Christian Confederate that springs up in the Civil War. And I want to make clear that by myth, I don't necessarily mean something that is false. What I really want to say is something that the Southern writer Eudora Welty once said, that myth is something that's twice as true as life. Okay, so that's what I'm talking about. In February of 1864, Confederate Brigadier General Robert F. Hoke's brigade fought their way across Bachelor's Creek near New Bern, North Carolina. Among the prisoners taken that day, Hoke's men found 22 of their own comrades who had deserted and taken up arms for the Union. Before the deserters were hanged in front of the entire brigade, Methodist chaplain John Parris visited each of them, baptizing 10 of the doomed men. A few days later, Parris preached a funeral sermon for the dead, quote, that the eyes of the living might be opened to view the horrid and ruinous crime and sin of desertion which had become so prevalent. Obliterating the line between sacred and secular, Parris compared the deserters to Judas Iscariot and implied that, like that arch-villain of the gospel story, they had betrayed a sacred cause for a few dirty pieces of silver offered to them by Abraham Lincoln. Though the style, tone, and structure of Parris's sermon derived from his Methodist calling, its moral content was drawn from a different paradigm, the Southern cult of honor. He fit the deserters into a familiar religious pattern of temptation, sin, and punishment. The deserters had seemed to be good men who fought to defend their country, but, warned Parris, in an evil hour, they yielded to mischievous influence and from motives or feelings base and sordid, unmanly and vile, resolved to abandon every principle of patriotism and sacrifice every impulse of honor. If my brother were to be guilty of such a high crime, Parris told his audience, I should certainly make an effort to have his name changed to something else, that I and my children after me might not feel the deep and lasting disgrace which his conduct had enstamped upon it. Parris also assured his audience that out of all the deserters he had ever spoken to in his career as a chaplain, only 3 had professed to be members of a church. And, quote, they had been no credit to the religion they professed, he declaimed, as it lived only upon their lips and was a stranger to their hearts. The true Christian is always the true patriot. Already in Parris's 1864 sermon, the core characteristics of the post-war myth of the Christian Confederate are apparent, carved in stark relief against the Methodist clergyman's portrayal of the irreligious, cowardly, and disgraced deserters. In his sermon, Parris compared the despicable character of the deserters to the noble mold of the late Stonewall Jackson, destined to become one of the primary saints in the cult of the lost cause. Where God had given the revolutionary generation a Washington, preached Parris, quote, he lent to us a Jackson, that bright and shining light of Christianity. Oh, what a model of a Christian soldier. Whether, quote, at the altars of God, around the campfires, or on the battlefield, Parris proclaimed, Jackson had been a perfect combination of Christian piety and martial valor. After the war, the Christian Confederate became the central mythology and the civil religion of the South's lost cause, a sacred trust that honored the fallen and forestalled the vision of the future laid out by the editor of the Macon, Georgia Christian Index, who in 1866 warned his readers, quote, the victory over Southern arms is to be followed by a victory over Southern opinions. The mythology of the Christian Confederate was central to the preservation of the racial and political status quo in the South after the war. Any advocate of change had to overcome the nearly insurmountable obstacle presented by the fact that a generation of the South's white manhood had sacrificed their lives for a Southern way of life that could not be abandoned without dishonoring their memory. Along with Jackson and Robert E. Lee, the common Southern soldier was included in the myth through the work of clergymen like John William Jones, a war chaplain whose book Christ in the Camp, published in 1887, documented the widespread revivals that took place in the Army of Northern Virginia during the war. We might ask, what made the myth of the Christian Confederates so powerful? Certainly the loss of life on so great a scale, at least 1 in 5 white Southerners of military age died in the war, went a long way towards enshrining the memory of the Confederate soldier. Yet, as the Reverend John Parris's sermon to Hoke's Brigade shows, the mythology of the Christian Confederate was both well-defined and in common usage before the South's defeat. To explain the power of this myth in the context of Southern culture, we must look not to the carnage of the war itself, but backwards, into the half-century before the war, to see how such a myth powerfully resolved a long-standing cultural tension between what, by the time of the Civil War, were the region's 2 overarching moral paradigms: evangelical Christianity and honor culture. Contemporary observers frequently noted the religious bent of the Southern mind on the eve of the war. Quote, "Men talk in public places, in the churches and in bar rooms, in the stagecoach and at the fireside of their personal communions with the deity, just as they do about family and business matters," wrote Northerner Frederick Law Olmsted in amazement on a trip through the South in the 1850s. During the first 3 decades of the 19th century, the Baptists, Methodists, and to a lesser degree Presbyterians solidified their hold on the religious affections of both white and black Southerners through a series of episodic revivals that began in Cane Ridge, Kentucky in 1801. Looking back on the history of his denomination in the state of Georgia in 1830, from the end of the Revolution to 1830, Methodist George Gilman Smith noted, quote, "Then the Methodists were humble, obscure, and poor. Now the judge on his bench, the congressman, and the assemblyman are not ashamed to be known as Methodists." By one estimate, 1 in 4 white Southerners were members of either the Baptist, Methodist, or Presbyterian church by the mid-1830s, while the number of white Southerners who heard regular preaching may have been as high as 3 in 4, since many attended churches without becoming members. Ironically, during roughly the same period that it became a stronghold of evangelical religion, the South also emerged as a hotbed of interpersonal violence. According to a recent sociological study, during the post-revolutionary era, regional homicide levels diverged sharply, dropping in the North and rising in the South, as revolutionary ideals threatened to destabilize traditional hierarchies of race and class, and the Southern economic landscape solidified, closing off avenues of opportunity for whites further down the social ladder, especially in the old seaboard states. Combined with a regional culture of honor that demanded violence in response to any perceived challenge, insult, or loss of status, these factors pushed levels of violence among Southerners to new heights. By 1842, one astonished English visitor estimated that levels of interpersonal violence in the South were 5 times as high as in the North and 10 times as high as any country in Europe, an exaggeration that nevertheless reflected a dark reality. Honor was central to this reality. Much more than a collection of rituals surrounding the duel, honor in the South was a deep-seated ethical system with its own internal logic and more than a passing resemblance to religion. Honor involved elements of the sacred, honor, and the profane, shame. It could be stained, requiring the expiatory sacrifice of blood to be restored. Thus, violence took on a moral significance within honor as a righteous or morally positive response to the threat of shame. Violence in response to an insult or in defense of one's home or family formed the core ethical demand of what one historian has called primal honor. This particular aspect of honor culture represented a formidable obstacle to the expansion of evangelical religion among Southern men. Where honor demanded violence, the religion of Christ demanded restraint and repentance. For many Southern men, the contradictions between the moral code of honor and the ethics implied by Christ's sacrifice on the cross could be profound, and can be seen clearly in the numerous records kept by evangelical churches throughout this era. Alongside drunkenness, violence was perhaps the most common male offense dealt with by church disciplinary committees. In 1805, for instance, William Hayes freely confessed to the congregation of Mountain Creek Baptist Church in Anderson, South Carolina, that he had sinned and, quote, considered himself faulty for a recent fight in which he had knocked his opponent to the ground for an unspecified offense. But Hayes also expressed his predicament, caught torn between the demands of two different communities, when he said with a hint of defiance, quote, that he should take care to do so no more, if he could help it. He couldn't help it, by the way. He shows up several times. All across the South, men offered their churches similarly conflicted explanations. Violence was a sin, a contradiction of godly order, but one that could not be avoided without contradicting the countervailing demands of honor. Church disciplinary committees, mostly composed of men, also felt the tension between what honor required and what the church demanded. During the period from the Revolution to the Civil War, Baptist congregations exhibited a notable ambivalence about violence, excluding only 4 in 10 men charged with fighting as compared to 8 in 10 men charged with sexual offenses. Further up the social ladder, from the backcountry Baptist churches where men repented for fighting, biting, and gouging their opponents, the clergy of the South united in fulminating against the duel, honor's central ritual among the South's upper classes. In 1807, following the death of a young Charleston man in a duel, Nathaniel Bowen, an Episcopal minister, decried dueling as, quote, a practice which, transmitted from our fathers, has, to a most lamentable extreme, extended its cruel influence, and even intruded where the mild and peaceful religion of the Savior should have totally excluded it. Though dueling declined in the North following the 1804 death of Alexander Hamilton at the hand of Aaron Burr, the practice retained its vitality in the South on the eve of the Civil War, when clergyman Arthur Wigfall denounced to his congregation the custom of, quote, offering human sacrifice to an imaginary deity, which you clothe in scarlet and call honor. At least one clergyman found himself confronting the imaginary deity directly. At South Carolina College in Columbia in 1856, a riot erupted when a drunken underclassman attempted to assault the town guard, who in turn promptly beat him and took him into custody. This happened all the time at colleges. A crowd of students determined to revenge their collective honor broke into the college armory and marched against the town militia, who had been called out to suppress them. Just as the situation appeared ready to spiral out of control, Presbyterian minister and recent president of the college, James Henley Thornwell, appeared, fresh from his theology lecture at nearby Columbia Seminary. A popular and respected figure at the college, Thornwell pleaded with the students to put down their weapons, telling them, quote, if I find you are in the right, and there be no redress but in fighting, I will lead you myself and die in the midst of you. Thornwell's gamble to avert catastrophe worked, and the students relented, retreating to the college chapel where Thornwell lectured them on their Christian duty to forbear. Though he averted violence in Columbia that day, in the midst of the secession crisis 5 years later, Thornwell would become one of South Carolina's most ardent defenders in her bid to maintain state sovereignty and honor. At first an opponent of secession, Thornwell became increasingly convinced that secession and military action were the inescapable demands of honor on the people of his state and region in the face of imminent Republican depredation. I gave up the Union with great pain, Thornwell wrote to his old mentor, General James Gillespie, in 1861, but I saw no alternative. Black republicanism had rendered it utterly impossible to remain in it with honor. I always thought that war would be the consequence, but preferred war to ignominious submission. Slavery may have been the root economic cause of the war, but it was the law of honor that finally compelled Southerners like Thornwell out of the Union. In the face of Lincoln's call for troops after the Southern attack on Fort Sumter, the long-standing tension between the law of honor and the law of God in Southern society evaporated in the heat of Southern indignation. In a moment of deep religious and cultural synergy that would echo through Southern history for decades with dramatic effects on Southern religion and cultural conceptions of manhood and honor, both of the South's dominant moral paradigms proclaimed the Southern cause and its soldiers altogether righteous. Two factors underlay the confluence of honor and religion that apotheosized in the Christian Confederate. First, state-sponsored violence, especially a defensive war such as the South envisioned itself fighting, had always received the sanction of the Christian establishment of the South. For instance, one observer recalled how during the War of 1812, the famous Baptist clergyman Richard Furman was seen on the lines of Charleston, quote, encouraging the men both by his prayers and by his example. There was little ambiguity among Southerners about the morality of violence in defense of state sovereignty and national as opposed to personal honor. Thus, James Henley Thornwell could dissuade the students of South Carolina College from attacking the town militia to defend their honor, but send his own son off to die in defense of the South's honor in Virginia in Wade Hampton's cavalry a few years later. In the view of honor, of course, martial valor was the preeminent form of moral courage. Beyond justifications of war in general, many pious Southerners viewed the present war as a contest between their faithful, God-fearing, slave-holding society and an apostate North. Holding to a literalist interpretation of the Bible which held slavery to be sanctioned in Holy Scripture, Southerners like James Henley Thornwell argued forcefully that an attack on slavery was nothing less than an attack on the Bible itself. To prove his point, Thornwell had only to point to radical abolitionists like William Lloyd Garrison, who loudly professed themselves willing to jettison the sacred text if it were found to support the peculiar institution. In the midst of the war, the religious periodicals that circulated widely in the Southern armies regularly portrayed the war as a war of religion. Quote, in its simplest form, wrote the editors of the Mississippi Messenger, the war with us is for freedom of conscience, freedom to interpret the Bible and worship God according to the dictates of our own consciences. In this cultural context, Southern warriors became quite literally defenders of honor, Southern honor, as well as soldiers of the cross. The defeat of the South and the unimaginable scale of death that accompanied it annealed the fragile but powerful connection between religion and honor produced by the war into a distinctive vision of white Southern manhood that had no true antebellum precedent. It also placed the post-war clergy in an unprecedented position to control the terms of debate over honor and increasingly definitions of masculinity. Where before the war the clergy were at pains to prove that Christianity did not sap the moral fiber of manly honor, after the war they only had to point to Stonewall Jackson to prove the undeniable truth that Christianity and honor were not enemies, but two sides of the common coin of Southern manhood. In the decades after the war, the figures of Lee and Jackson would play a part in campaigns against dueling and for prohibition, battles that the religious camp largely won, with combatants brandishing the Confederate heroes to prove that being a Christian made one no less a man. In a composite portrait of the antebellum Southern man at the center, journalist Wilbur J. Cash once noted how, quote, the boast, voiced or not, on the part of every Southerner that he would knock the hell out of whoever dared cross him, existed alongside his preference for, quote, a faith as simple and emotional as himself, a faith to draw men together in hordes, to terrify them with apocalyptic rhetoric, to cast them into the pit, rescue them, and at last bring them shouting into the fold of grace. Perhaps Cash, writing in 1941, could not have realized that these two aspects of the Southern mind had been much more in tension before the war than after, when the mythology of the Christian Confederates served to contain and symbolically to reconcile them. In the decades after Cash wrote, the distinctive mix of masculinity and faith he described continued to resonate in Southern religion, politics, music, and popular culture. It still resounds today in pregame prayer circles in Southern sports stadiums, in country music, and on ubiquitous bumper stickers such as the one that reads, "Real men love Jesus." For white Southerners, the historical roots of this unique link between religious faith and masculinity are sunk deep in the fertile soil of the Christian Confederates' grave. From the Civil War until today, his figure has remained central to conceptions of white Southern masculinity, a North Star by which succeeding generations of Southerners have navigated the complicated relationship between the aggressive and self-exalting demands of honor and the sacrificial and self-denying values of the cross. Thank you.
Thank you, Bob. Luke Harlow, one of Professor John Boles' former graduate students, is an assistant professor of history at Oakland University in Rochester, Michigan. A co-editor of the Journal of Southern Religion, he is the author of Religion, Race, and the Making of Confederate Kentucky, 1830 to 1880, forthcoming from Cambridge University Press. His paper today is titled Confederate After the Fact, Pro-Slavery Religion in the Case of Civil War Kentucky. Please welcome Luke Harlow.
Thank you. It's a pleasure to be here, especially because some of the research that I'll be presenting today was completed in your fabulous holdings in 19th century Baptist newspapers. So it's a great honor to deliver this work here. To be a white Southerner in the middle of the 19th century was to believe that the Christian God ordained slavery. The Confederate States of America, whose Constitution invoked the favor and guidance of Almighty God, it's a quote, represented the political application of that doctrine. The core of Confederate identity was pro-slavery religion, which was also the heart of white Southern identity in the period. But some constituencies came late to this truth. In July 1874, the Central Methodist, the weekly newspaper of the Kentucky Conference of the Methodist Episcopal Church South, published a forceful article on antebellum slavery titled, "Was Our Position on the Slavery Question Scriptural?" The article answered the question it posed forthrightly and in the affirmative. For the last several years, the Central Methodist, like Methodist newspapers throughout the country, had offered opinion on whether or not the northern and southern branches of National Methodism should engage in what they called fraternal relations. The Methodist Episcopal Church, the United States' largest religious group prior to the Civil War, fractured in 1844 along sectional lines after long-standing conflict over the slavery question. Now, in 1874, nearly a decade after the Civil War and 13th Amendment ended slavery, and 30 years beyond the denominational schism, some Methodists in both the North and the South sought to put sectional differences aside and reunite the denomination. The Central Methodists, however, could countenance no such reunion. Quote, "We don't ask our Northern brethren to come to our opinion, we cannot go to theirs. If Northern Methodists enter into fraternal relations with us, they must do so with the distinct understanding that we occupy the same ground on this question that we have always occupied." The point was plain, and the decidedly unreconstructed Central Methodist wanted its reader to understand, quote, "What we were in 1844, we still are." Just a few months prior, the paper blamed the split of 1844 on the, quote, "unscriptural and radical abolition policy that some Northern Methodists had pursued." The Central Methodist editors would not pretend that their former enemies were now their allies. Although they had admitted elsewhere that the idea of, quote, "free and full sectional rapprochement" was attractive, they refused to endorse it at the, quote, "expense of principle." At the most basic level, that principle required the acknowledgement that the antebellum Southern Methodist defense of slavery was biblically correct. By insisting on slavery's scriptural sanction nearly a decade after the death of legal slavery, the Central Methodist asserted that slavery remained a divinely approved institution regardless of legal realities. Such an opinion had significant political implications, especially when it came to matters of race. The Central Methodist, like white religious newspapers throughout the South, was a vociferous critic of civil rights for African Americans. Indeed, in the months leading up to the passage of the Civil Rights Act of 1875, the Central Methodist openly opposed the bill. After reprinting part of a Northern Methodist article that championed the virtues of integrationism for the post-slavery order, the Central Methodist editors asked a question their readers presumably already knew the answer to. Quote, "The two ends of the Northern Church are the social equality of the races and an organic union with our church. How do you like the program?" For Kentucky's white Methodists, the implication was explicit. Their true religion was one to be practiced without Northern white or African American influence or interference. The case of the state's white Methodists illuminates a larger trend that occurred among evangelical whites in Kentucky in the 10 years following emancipation. In Reconstruction-era Kentucky, as elsewhere in the South, white evangelicals represented a preponderant political majority. In the case of Kentucky, more than 70% of the white population and nearly 60% of the state's total population. And religious whites comprised a driving force in the state's post-war embrace of Confederate identity. Although Kentucky remained with the Union during the Civil War, it is nevertheless a historical truism that Kentucky became Confederate after the fact. Religion was a critical part of this process because whatever the war might have decided, the war did not change white Southerners' minds that God had ordained slavery. The Reconstruction-era case of white Kentucky demonstrates the strength and vitality of pro-slavery religion, particularly the longevity of its anti-abolitionist and white supremacist animus. The fact that these developments occurred in Kentucky, as much as they did in more deeply southern states like Mississippi or South Carolina, highlights pro-slavery religion's purchase on the white mind of the post-war South. Kentucky's future course, however, was anything but certain on the eve of the Civil War. As a middle ground state, slaveholding state on the borderlands between slave and free soil, throughout the antebellum era, the state fostered a vocal evangelical minority anti-slavery movement, which culminated with a failed attempt in 1849 to enter an emancipationist clause into the state's constitution. White Kentucky's late antebellum opponents of slavery, however, were predominantly gradual emancipationists who favored black removal through West African colonization schemes and who forthrightly invoked the language of white supremacy. For most white evangelicals in Kentucky, arguments against slavery were not arguments against white supremacy. Moreover, white religious Kentuckians, like white evangelicals more broadly in the South, long rejected abolitionism for committing what they saw as a twofold form of heresy. The first was theological. Abolitionists contravened 19th century standards of American evangelical orthodoxy. The second was racist. By demanding an immediate end to slavery, abolitionists threatened the secure social fabric of America, which required the dominance of a pure race class of white elite leadership. Thus, when slavery was legally abolished, Kentucky's pre-war anti-slavery conservatives changed to make common cause with those who exhibited a more stridently pro-slavery approach before the war. In other words, when slavery disappeared, so too did the middle ground. The result was a racist unity legitimated by postbellum clergy and laity who rejected civil rights for African Americans, embraced a Confederate memory of the Civil War, paved the way for the emergence of a dominant white democratic political bloc in the state. Kentucky thus found itself in lockstep with the rest of the white Christian South, institutionally securing solidarities of region and race. Much of the debate between Southern and Northern believers in the Reconstruction era centered on the differences, or for some, the potential for unity, between the various sectional branches of various Protestant denominations. The terms of that debate were construed to increase friction and division between the South and North because, as one historian has put it, each side insisted that their interpretation of the Civil War, and by extension slavery, was correct. This was precisely the case made in 1867 in the Christian Observer, a Southern Methodist newspaper published in Catlettsburg, Kentucky, located at the confluence of the Ohio and Big Sandy rivers, the dividing line between Kentucky and West Virginia. The paper condemned the idea of Methodist reunion because the Northern Church required, as they saw it, two extra-biblical standards of intersectional denominational fellowship. Quote, loyalty to the general government and opposition to slavery. But bridging Methodism's sectional breach, the paper contended, would only happen when, quote, we are willing to adopt their political creed and receive the mark of the beast. The Northern Church, in the words of these Kentucky Methodists, had made an illicit deal with the devil for their church's soul. It was a deal the white South wanted no part of. Kentucky's white Methodists, in attacking the North's purportedly politicized religion, claimed their own contention actually had little to do with the slavery question itself. It is difficult to imagine, however, the course of the postbellum debate without reference to slavery. Indeed, it was the legacy of the slavery debates that gave rise to similar intersectional rancor in the bluegrass states' other denominations. In January 1866, Louisville's Free Christian Commonwealth, Presbyterian newspaper, published an exceedingly favorable report on an 1865 declaration by the Southern Presbyterian Church on the Civil War and slavery. The document so succinctly summarized the white Christian South's view of the stakes of the old religion and slavery dispute for the post-slavery order that it merits lengthy quotation. Quote, while the existence of slavery may in its civil respects be regarded as a settled question, an issue now gone, the lawfulness of the relation as a question of social morality and of scriptural truth has lost nothing of its importance. When we solemnly declare to you, brethren, that the abolition dogma, which asserts the inherent sinfulness of this relation, is unscriptural and fanatical, that it is condemned not only by the word of God, but by the voice of the church in all ages, that it is one of the most pernicious heresies of modern times, that its countenance by any church is a just cause of separation from it, we have surely said enough to warn you away from this insidious error, as from a fatal shore. Such arguments resonated quite broadly in Kentucky. Just after Confederate surrender in the summer of 1865, Kentucky Baptists, members of the Southern Baptist Convention, established in 1845 on a pro-slavery platform, found themselves embroiled in a controversy that would highlight their growing distance from Northern believers. In May 1865, the Northern American Baptist Home Mission Society met in St. Louis, Missouri. A substantial part of that meeting contained speeches suggesting how Northern Baptists might contribute to the South's religious reconstruction. As one speaker put it, thanks to emancipation and Union military victory, quote, slavery has received its death blow. Now Northern Baptists found themselves faced with the task of providing, quote, missionary care for freed people. And as slave soil, the mandate clearly applied to Kentucky. D.W. Phillips, a New Englander who had been working as a Baptist missionary in East Tennessee, expressed his hope that the Home Mission Society would be able to gain local support, specifically in the case of Kentucky, draw its missionaries from within the state. Of course, Phillips admitted, such local collaborators would have to prove their mettle as, quote, suitable men. For Phillips, that term meant Baptists of, quote, unquestionable loyalty to the government of the United States, men who approve of the policy of the government on slavery. Northern Baptists would not ally themselves with, quote, pro-slavery ministers of any kind, nor with those whose hearts throb for 4 sad years in favor of the rebellion of the South. To be sure, Phillips acknowledged his fear that such candidates would be hard to find in the Commonwealth, but he believed, quote, many loyal preachers existed in Kentucky. In point of fact, Phillips' suspicion that most white Kentucky Baptists would treat Northern overtures confrontationally proved exceedingly perceptive. Bluegrass Baptists were predictably appalled, and the state's flagship Baptist newspaper, the Western Recorder, printed a reactionary riposte from Henry McDonald, a renowned minister from Madison County, Kentucky. In his response to the meeting of the American Baptist Home Mission Society, the Kentuckian spared no polemical verbiage. McDonald had, quote, watched the churches of the North with continual sorrow in my heart at the abundant evidence of the terrible apostasy from the truth as it is in Jesus Christ. Long before the Civil War, Northern, quote, altars of the faith had been polluted by blasphemous debaucheries. Now in the war's immediate aftermath, Northern churches had devolved further. The only real concern for Yankee believers was, quote, Negro suffrage, Negro bravery, Negro superiority. As MacDonald saw it, Northern Christians could make no claim to the title because rather than a pure faith, quote, they have determined to know nothing among the people but the Negro and him crucified. Kentuckians wanted no part of such a program. In a sentence, MacDonald summarized the opinion of his state's fellow white believers. Quote, Kentucky Baptists have their own plans and can do their own work. Kentucky Presbyterians likewise fought tooth and nail for many years over who would control their denomination's religious future in the state. As with Baptist, 1865 proved particularly fractious. Every year since the start of the war, the Northern Presbyterian Church USA's General Assembly, that is its national overarching body, in which at this time nearly all bluegrass Presbyterians claimed membership. Over the course of the war, it had made nationalist pro-union statements that border state Presbyterians found increasingly disconcerting. In 1865, however, the Assembly went too far for border state taste. Meeting less than a month after Confederate surrender in May 1865, the General Assembly passed two major resolutions on the nation and slavery. Noting that there were some ministers who had sided with the Presbyterian Church in the Confederate States of America during the war who might seek to reapply for ordination in the Northern Presbyterian Church, the General Assembly required two tests. First, ministers who had, quote, in any way, directly or indirectly, been involved in aiding or countenancing the rebellion and the war were required to confess and forsake that action as sin. Second, ministers had to disavow the idea that, quote, the system of Negro slavery in the South is a divine institution, and that it is the peculiar mission of the Southern Church to conserve it. Any Southern minister who refused to repent of these errors would not be allowed to preach in the Presbyterian Church USA. Those proclamations, while couched in the language of sectional reconciliation, only served to intensify the schism between Northern and Southern Presbyterians. Southerners perceived these proclamations not as an olive branch of Christian goodwill, but instead as a Yankee rod of chastisement designed to humiliate a conquered enemy. For adherents in Kentucky, moreover, the actions of the 1865 General Assembly proved the beginning of the end of their fellowship with the Northern branch of the denomination. While many religious Kentuckians had not ever willingly taken arms against the United States, the idea that slavery was an inherently sinful institution proved too difficult to accept. Moreover, since the Emancipation Proclamation did not apply to Kentucky, and the 13th Amendment at this time, the middle of 1865, was not yet law, slavery remained legal in Kentucky. To Kentuckians, the General Assembly was speaking to political affairs it had no business addressing. In response, Kentucky's Southern sympathizing Presbyterian press marshaled much of the vitriol at its disposal. A late April 1865 article in the Free Christian Commonwealth reviewed the course of Northern commingling of religion and politics in the Civil War. Relying on tropes well familiar to white evangelicals in the South, the essay argued, quote, anti-slavery fanaticism is malignant and ferocious. Abolitionists had forced the Civil War because they, quote, denounced the federal Constitution as a covenant with hell and an agreement with death, because it recognized and protected slave property. The abolition clergy hate slavery, hate slaveholders, and hate and abuse all men who oppose their mad and destructive schemes. With the war coming to an end, abolitionists now engage in a, quote, new Negrophile crusade to make an inferior race predominant over a superior one, or to give African American citizenship rights and the vote. The time for action against such a debased faith had come. Louisville Presbyterians collectively responded to the actions of the 1865 General Assembly with a monumental document titled Declaration and Testimony Against the Erroneous and Heretical Doctrines and Practices Propagated in the Presbyterian Church. The document represented a fundamental rejection of an abolition-minded faith. It denounced 14 errors in the Presbyterian Church USA. Not only did the church disregard the commonly held white opinion that, quote, the immediate indiscriminate emancipation of the Negro slaves amongst us would be unjust and injurious to both master and slave, but it had, quote, laid down a new doctrine on slavery unknown to the apostolic and primitive church, a doctrine which has its origins in infidelity and fanaticism. Slavery, quote, an institution which has always existed in the church uncondemned, which was recognized by Christ and his apostles, is pronounced an evil and guilt, condemned as sin, affirmed to be the root of rebellion, war, bloodshed, and the long list of horrors which follow in their train. By perpetuating such ideas, the Northern General Assembly, the Declaration argued, quote, has become the support of heresy, the abettor of injustice and despotism, the fomenter of discord. The document ended with a somber word. The signers of the Declaration would no longer recognize any religious authority for matters of church rule other than, quote, the written word of God. Until Northern believers recognized the divine mandate for slavery, Kentuckians would withhold all financial contributions from denominational boards. And they kept their word. By the end of 1868, after much ecclesiastical wrangling, the vast majority of Kentucky Presbyterians had either withdrawn or been forced out of the Northern denomination. And in 1869, Kentucky Presbyterians voted overwhelmingly to join the Southern Presbyterian Church, a denomination founded in 1861 as the Presbyterian Church in the Confederate States of America, which affirmed the divine sanction for American slavery. In the years to come, such opinions would closely align with those held by white religious conservatives further south. Evangelical in tone, stridently anti-Northern in geographical outlook, constructed for whites only. This brand of Christianity made for a potent ideological amalgam that fueled a long-lasting white Southern racist hegemony. That whites in Kentucky came to a broad religious agreement with such a pro-Confederate religious stance is ironic, given the state's maintenance of Union allegiance during the Civil War. But it is not surprising. During the Reconstruction era, white Kentuckians drew on long-standing theological arguments against abolitionism and in defense of slavery that they themselves had held for decades. As historian Drew Faust has cogently explained, quote, the most fundamental source of legitimation for the Confederacy was Christianity. White Kentuckians did not fight for the Confederacy in large number, but in the Reconstruction era they came to know this truth nonetheless. For Kentucky, pro-slavery religion proved a critical ideological building block in the making of the Commonwealth's post-war Confederate identity. Thank you.
Oh, thank you, Luke. Commenting on the papers today is John Boles, the William P. Hobby Professor of History at Rice University. And a little over 10 years ago, we were fortunate to have him as the Robert Foster Cherry Professor here at Baylor. He is a mentor to legions of graduate students and a preeminent scholar of the American South and its religious history. He is most recently the author of Seeing Jefferson Anew, in His Time and Ours. Throughout his 30 years at Rice University, Professor Boles has served as the editor of the Journal of Southern History. Please welcome John Boles.
Thanks, Mike. It's good to be back and see familiar people and see familiar terrain. I realize, it's getting toward noon, so I'm aware of that. So I'm not in my normal 55-minute mode here. And I also want to congratulate the three paper givers for staying within their time limits. I mean, you may not know how rare that is, but it's really nice. And it's hard to do, and I can tell by people reading. And they didn't do it by trick. Sometimes people have a paper that's 11 pages long, which is the right reading length, but 25 pages of notes, so they've gotten 2/3 of the paper sort of hidden. But these were just right. Well, the three fine papers we have just heard clearly and definitively make the point that without close consideration of religion, we cannot understand the main currents of the American historical experience. Certainly that was manifestly true for the 18th and 19th centuries, if less so for today. Humans do not act just for economic reasons. They are not simply cold, rational actors. They do not just follow the impulses of their emotions or the commands of a leader. Surely these factors must be taken into account, but even more so should the larger systems of meaning within which persons seek understanding of their human situation and ultimate purpose for their lives. And this was especially true for a population that was largely literate and heavily influenced by more than a millennium of Christian teaching. By every measure, 19th century Americans, white and black, though here we're mostly talking about whites, accepted a basic worldview shaped by Christian concepts. And in the U.S. South, the predominant Christianity was one of the evangelical variety, heavily weighted toward the preachings of Baptist, Methodist, Presbyterian, and Episcopalian ministers, especially the first two. In an age without mass media and the distractions of high-profile sports, religious sermons and services, debates, newspapers, and religious tracts played a cultural role hardly imaginable today. As a result, most persons were far more religiously literate than are Americans today, far more familiar with the tropes and characters of the Bible, and quick to turn to religion to make sense out of both everyday life and the largest issues of the day. For most mainstream citizens, a variety of interlocked theological ideas, expressed non-technically as an almost folk religion, provided the system of meaning out of which they interpreted their lives and in terms of which they responded to the various demands, large and small, placed on them. If we are to understand why the people acted as they did, felt as they did, rationalized and justified their behavior as they did, we must take seriously their religious worldview. Religion was not just window dressing or a veneer used to cover baser motives, although for some people it could be, but rather an indispensable part of the internal gyroscope that guided people through life. All three of the papers presented today accept the large role that religion, Christianity, played in the Civil War era United States. This enables them to explain and interpret what happened then with a degree of sophistication and completeness denied to those who are not alert to the religious dimension of the past. Amy Murrell Taylor focuses our attention on an aspect of the Civil War that was long overlooked when historians were almost totally preoccupied with military events. Even before Union policy was clear about how to handle slaves who were escaping their bondage and coming to Union armies, and before the Emancipation Proclamation, tens of thousands of ex-slave refugees sought freedom with their feet and fled to the Union camps, causing huge problems in terms of housing, food, disease, clothing, and order. At times, the Union forces were almost overwhelmed with the number of displaced persons in their midst. In an age before public health requirements were fully understood, and before the North had developed the infrastructure to accommodate such numbers, the refugee camps became pitiful scenes of hunger, disease, and confusion. No one had foreseen that such numbers of former slaves, called contraband, would escape their bondage in such fashion, and the Northern forces were simply unprepared. The escapees often arrived clothed almost in rags. Understandably, the refugee camps were at times places of suffering that reminds one today of wartime POW camps. The Northern civilians, especially those sent by Northern reform agencies to attempt to minister to these refugees, were unprepared for the misery, suffering, and death that they encountered. And given their religious views, an automatic turn to religion to understand what they were seeing and the obvious plight of the poor black refugees, the religious reformers sought to interpret the situation within the confines of their religious worldview. Assuming that God, providence, caused or directed everything, they soon turned to interpret the contraband or refugee camps as God's intended halfway house between slavery and freedom. The suffering which in biblical terms often prepared sufferers for redemption, was to be expected. And remembering the Exodus story of the Israelite journey out of slavery in Egypt, lasting for 40 years and involving many hardships before the promised land was reached, religious interpreters likewise saw the contraband experience as analogous to that kind of transition, which, after the suffering was endured, would result in freedom. This interpretation was seen, I think, less as a rationalization for the hardships than an explanation of why it was occurring. The analogy to the Exodus theme ennobled the sufferers, and the missionaries reported moving examples of the patience, fortitude, even contentment of the freed people, and gave both them and concerned Northerners promise that the travail of the contraband camps and the contraband sufferers would eventually end in freedom. Rather than excess blame for the refugee troubles, this approach offered ultimate hope and justification. While little could be done to address the larger issues of overcrowding and so forth that's exacerbated the contraband problem, the missionaries often focused on the issue of providing clothing. In fact, their emphasis on clothing is almost puzzling, until one remembers that the refugees were arriving often in family groups with only the clothing on their backs, and that was usually sparse and ragged. And most of the letters discussing the need for clothing were written in the dead of winter, December, January, and February, when cold weather made skimpy clothing the most immediate and pressing problem. Providing clothing was also something tangible that sympathetic Northerners could do to help the sufferers, and they wanted to do something. Soon the provision of clothing became not just a humanitarian emergency that could be largely solved, but a visible symbol of the profound transformation promised by the contraband experience. As the ragged garb of slave clothing was replaced with the clean, sturdy cloth made at first by free Yankee hands and then increasingly by freedmen, so too was bondage being replaced with freedom and a sense of self-sufficiency. In a way, clothes do make the men. And here, very visibly, former slaves were being turned into freemen. In his equally interesting paper, Bob Elder widens his chronological focus to help us understand the evolution of what he calls the Christian Confederate, the mythological formulation of the Southern soldier who became an iconic figure in the post-war lost cause ideology that effectively turned the battle for the Confederacy into a glorious and Christianized lost cause. By beginning with the stunning funeral oration of the Reverend John Paris, preached on the occasion of the execution of 22 Confederate turncoats in February 1864, Elder shows that the construction of the image of the Christian Confederate, a blending of two paradigmatic cultural themes, honor and Christianity, was already underway before Appomattox. How did these apparently opposite styles come to be joined, Elder asked. The answer lies in a careful examination of the two. Honor was associated with violence, a quick defense of oneself in the face of shame, a sense that one's value was not validated internally, but rather externally in how others responded to you. Honor was seen as primarily a masculine trait, and it had to be instantly and always defended. The traditional Christian virtues, on the other hand, suggested patience, love, a sense of forgiveness, and was inwardly validated through one's faith. Christian values were often seen as feminine, and Christians should turn the other cheek rather than proceed with a chip on the shoulder. Throughout the antebellum era, the cult of honor and the profession of Christianity were usually understood to be in tension. Yet during the Civil War, these two sets of values were, in Elder's term, annealed into one, a kind of wartime alloy that created the Christian Confederate. Primal honor made Southern white men support the Confederate cause because politicians and Lincoln's call for volunteers were an affront to corporate Southern honor. And Christian ministers who believed slavery was supported by the Bible and the Confederacy was a Christian nation, saw abolitionist attacks on both as apostasy. I don't believe that honor, quote, compelled Southerners out of the Union, but it was a large factor. Certainly many white men believed they were honor-bound to defend the Confederacy, and others believed their Christian faith required them to defend the Confederacy. So there was a wartime merging that produced what Elder calls the image of the Christian Confederate, a strongly masculine version of the crusading Christian. There is much to this, but I'm not fully convinced that most Southern men were so motivated by what Burton White Brown called honor. I think many fought for their homeland out of a sense of duty, which had deeper roots in Christianity and other traditions to draw from than simply primal honor. At times I fear Professor White Brown has defined honor so universally that it can be used to explain everything and anything and nothing. And that said, I do believe Elder is onto something very important when he delineates the evolution of this wartime holy warrior. Yet I'm also not fully persuaded that this hyper-masculine, even militaristic image of the Christian Confederate lasted long after the war, except in lost cause rhetoric. Like most of the wartime changes that Emory Thomas pointed to decades ago in his provocative little book, The Confederacy as a Revolutionary Experience, the image of the masculine Christian faded. Approximately 2/3 of church membership in the post-Civil War South was women. I think the tension that historian Ted Ormsby found between masculine aggressiveness and home-centered evangelicalism in the half-century after the Civil War suggests that the militant male Christian was a short-lived phenomenon. And perhaps the rise more recently of bumper stickers like "Real Men Love Jesus" and the Promise Keepers movement are reactions to the dominance of the softer, more feminine, pacifist, loving characteristics of Christianity, even in the South. Like Bob Elder, Luke Harlow employs a wide chronological lens as he examines religion in Civil War era Kentucky. And like Elder, he assumes, quote, that the core of Confederate identity was pro-slavery religion. And while Harlow goes back to the antebellum period to trace out Kentucky's complicated history with regard to slavery, most of his emphasis is on the post-war era, because it is then that, famously, Kentucky became Confederate. Central to this post-war conversion was the continued hold of pro-slavery religion on the mind of white Kentuckians. Before the Civil War, Kentucky was riven into three factions: a northern-oriented Unionist faction that was essentially abolitionist, a middle ground of moderate emancipationists who were cautiously anti-slavery, but starkly racist nevertheless, and hence not radical abolitionists, and a conservative group of pro-slavery advocates. At the secession crisis, the middle group of emancipationists did not advocate leaving the Union, even though they were strongly racist and anti-black. After the war, with slavery gone, there was no need for a middle ground, and the formerly emancipationist evangelicals, their white supremacist views intact, merged with the former secessionists. The new majority of white evangelicals after the war was pro-slavery in the abstract and strongly supportive of Southern white racism. They still believed that the Bible supported slavery, that it was, as Harlow says, a divinely approved institution regardless of legal realities, and that Northerners were politically anti-Southern and theologically heretical. In other words, they believed the Confederate form of government had been correct in its explicit support of slavery and mention of God in its Constitution. In short, Kentucky became culturally and politically Confederate after the Civil War, with all the vicious racism that implied. In a larger sense, Harlow is arguing that all those years that white Southerners had spent listening to sermons employing the Holy Scriptures to defend slavery and support white racism had a permanent influence and did not immediately dissipate in 1865. I mean, you think about it, it's kind of amazing. You read a lot about pro-slavery religion and all that kind of stuff, and then the Civil War happens, and then that just seems to just disappear. It didn't disappear. The long-term effects were tragic because this racist Christianity did not just defend slavery, but became the underpinning of a form of racism that later fueled the rise of segregation that lasted into the mid-20th century. David Chappelle, in his important book, A Stone of Hope, has implied that white segregationist forces in the 1950s had no effective theological tradition with which to defend segregation. But as Harlow suggests, what might be more accurately called a folk theological tradition, and here I'm going to sort of rearrange some phrases of his sentence, a potent ideological amalgam that was evangelical in tone, stridently anti-northern in geographical outlook, and constructed for whites only, fueled a long-lasting white southern racist hegemony. Neither the Civil War nor the following century of southern racial history can be comprehended without taking account of religion. And of course, although it is outside our topic today, the heart of the civil rights movement that ultimately changed the arc of southern history lies in Christianity as well. So, I mean, I think just basically there's no way to understand the history of the South, or actually the North, without taking religion seriously. We today have heard 3 well-researched, thoughtful, and stimulating papers. All were provocative in the best sense of the word. We couldn't ask for any more for our presenters, and we owe them a hearty thanks.
I think we have a few minutes for questions from the audience. If anyone would like to ask a specific question of any of our presenters, yes.
Clayton Jewett from Baylor. Let me have a couple of questions for you. First of all, I thought you did a really good job of emphasizing that clothing's transformative power was the view of the missionaries. But my question is, did the freedmen see it that way? Did they accept the clothing graciously or out of fear? Especially considering that many of the slaves, except for the household slaves, are used to growing up without clothes, despite what the law might have said. And the clothes they did have were Osnaburg cotton, which is that's fine. So my question is, did they really accept the clothing graciously or out of fear? And did the efforts of the missionaries actually change the worldview of the freedmen as it pertains to race relations?
Okay.
So a few questions in there.
Yeah, but it all comes down to where's the perspective of the freedmen in my paper, which was not there deliberately, and not to dodge, but this is a work in progress, and that's one angle of it where I'm not entirely confident yet to be able to draw some big conclusions, partly because it stems from kind of the classic problem of really trying to get at their voices of what's happening in the camps. But I am, and it's there. Not only in some firsthand accounts, which come from usually their interactions with the military, but which talk about some of this that's going on. But also it's from just, using the missionaries' writings to try to figure out what the freedmen were thinking and saying. And I'm having some, I'm struggling with this a bit. And, in my paper, I present these observations of the freedmen being very grateful, as you point out, and also being very patient in their sufferings and content. And I'm a little skeptical of that, but at the same time, maybe there's something to it. I mean, this is over and over again in the missionaries' writings. So I'm trying to figure out how to use the missionaries' writings to get at them. But they do accept the clothing, to get to the shorter question. How exactly, I can't really say, but I wouldn't be surprised if they were grateful to some degree. I mean, and as Professor Boles pointed out, there is a seasonal element to this. It does really pick up in the winter months. And I'm trying to look at right now also about migrations. When, do they pick up in the winter months as well? Do they coincide? But in a way, I'm dodging the question a little bit, but I'm hoping to get at it.
I think in all of that, also the location of the camps are important. A winter in Virginia is much different than a winter in Mississippi.
Yes.
So,
yeah. And also not just for weather reasons. One thing I'm looking at is just generally environmental factors. I mean, some of them are stuck in an island in the Mississippi River, which is very different from being up in Northern Virginia.
Right.
So it does affect their physical experience.
Thank you.
All right, any other questions?
I'd like to add, though, that there's a lot of evidence that slaves were very aware of the symbolic value of slavery, of clothing, and that they did not wear just the kind of cheap clothing that was handed to them, but they wore the hand-me-downs and worn-out clothes given to them by their masters. And they took apart those clothes and sort of accessorized themselves, sort of individualizing themselves. And there's a lot of evidence of how slaves saw that how they dressed made statements about their individuality, even how they cut their hair and so forth. So it seems to me to make a lot of sense that they would see, in some sense, shifting from the kind of worn-out clothing of slavery to the better clothing of freedom is, in some subtle sense, making the move to a different kind of life.
I would agree with you on the larger plantations and more established plantations in the east. But as we move west, we see that conditions are a lot harsher for slave owners themselves and for the slaves. I would probably tend to disagree.
Just a suggestion, if you widen the focus a little bit, internationally, in exactly these years, there is much more of a sense of a need for a larger and more intense intervention in the aftermath of war, and a more organized intervention. And the two most famous examples, of course, are the Crimean War in the 1850s, and the sense that individual charity won't work. But the other great one is it's 1859. You have this great battle of Solferino, and people look at the horror following the battlefield, and that's what leads directly to the foundation of the Red Cross, and the idea of getting food, clothing, and all these things to the victims of war and their families. Is something which is emerging in exactly these years. So it's not just an American thing at this time. Just an observation.
Yeah, no, thank you.
Yes.
Just for the panel, you can comment. Do you think Abraham Lincoln, if he would have survived the assassination, would have been able to stop the religious part of what y'all been talking about in the South? Would he have been able to control that and maybe shape where we would have to gone through 100 years more of basically another war?
He's asking you.
Oh, the old what if question.
Feel free, anybody can jump on that.
I've already answered you guys.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I mean, I think essentially what you're talking about is if he had lived and enacted the kind of Reconstruction that perhaps he might have instituted, would this or not. I just tend to think, this is purely me, and I'm going right off the deep end here. I tend to think that the cultural forces that we're talking about here were set in motion, they had roots, as I was talking about, far back before the war, and many of them were kind of solidified coming out, into the Reconstruction era. So I would tend to, I would say that it would be very difficult for top-down political policies to have a real impact on that. That said, I'm sure it might have.
I would say forcefully no, actually. I think just as Bob just said, I mean, these political decisions are in some sense, they change, they change the contours, but I don't, when we're talking about commitments to these kinds of cultural institutions, cultural values, these are deeply ingrained, deeply held beliefs. And so while there may have been some kind of change over time, the sort of attenuating of values may have taken a different way, the values, I think, remain.
I agree. I mean, Lincoln obviously couldn't have caused all the difference, but it would have been significantly better if Lincoln had been president, because we went from a president who I think was amazingly articulate and could speak from a biblical cadence and could speak to these kind of religious values. We went from him to one of the worst possible presidents. And I think that it's hard to underestimate the power of articulate moral leadership at the top. So I think that Lincoln would have been able to address these issues in a way maybe no other American president ever could have. But even so, as I think these values were so deeply entrenched and been listened to for so many years, he couldn't have made all the difference in the world. But I think it could possibly have made some difference. I mean, I just do think that really good leadership at the top makes a difference in how societies work, particularly if that leader knows how to talk the language of the people. And I think Lincoln knew that kind of religious talk. And you read his major addresses, I mean, they live because they are so central, I think, to the sort of Christian tradition.
He's pro-union and pro-slavery, and then becomes anti-slavery, pro-civil rights. Is he sort of just that, an anomaly? And how would you, say that he's been able to, that he's the twice nominated governor, or is he sort of being squeezed out of the larger Presbyterian and Southern white movement at that point?
No, it's a good question. To answer quickly to your major question, is he an anomaly? I would say yes. But he's not such an anomaly that he didn't have support, right? So there's people that support his cause. One of the things that happens is that in Kentucky, when African Americans get the vote, they get it for keeps. And so there's a black minority Republican Party sort of caucus, you might say, that functions in some serious way. And there is a committed core of folks like Harlan who are Reconstruction, post-Reconstruction unionists, and who sort of stand against the overarching system, you might say. But that's a minority movement, and it's a movement that becomes increasingly kind of winnowed off in a way. So without getting into too much minutia here, if you read any kind of post-Civil War political histories of Kentucky, it's basically a story of how the Democratic Party takes power and controls power for a long time. And there are some anomalies with Kentucky in the 20th century in voting patterns, and things like when Al Smith runs for the presidency, they diverge because he's a Catholic. But their pattern sort of fits that of the Solid South for the next 100 years with a few divergences.
I wonder if you could comment. I'm thinking this question comes out of Eugene Genovese's collection of lectures about 10 years ago, where he draws a distinction between a kind of biblical view of slavery and a kind of scientific racism view of segregation. And I wonder if you just comment on how those two either work together or sometimes in tension with each other, and how were they the same, were they different? If you just comment on that a little bit.
I think in a sense, Genovese is right that the scientific view of racism that he talks about is polygenesis, multiple human origins. And of course, if you are a biblical literalist, as these folks were, you cannot accept that because there is one common human progenitor. So I think Genovese is right on that score. But I think he underestimates the power of racism as a kind of cultural way of understanding things. The historian Stephen Haynes has used the term intuitive racism. And he's talked about, the ways in which, Mark Knoll has talked about the ways in which people read racism into text in spite of themselves. And so the irony is in rejecting a kind of scientific racism, it actually strengthens the biblical pro-slavery argument, which depends upon a kind of white supremacist understanding of things. And so there's a kind of tension that's in play there that is in Genovese's case maybe a bit overstated.
Any other questions? Yes.
Question for Dr. Taylor, please. I wonder if there may be another model for the phenomenon you described as seeing the transition state between previous life and a glorious future in accounts of deathbeds in evangelical literature, which were very common and very full. A very large proportion of obituaries usually consisted of deathbed scenes where there was a great deal of attribution of the role of what was going on to providence, and very often comment on the contentment of the subjects. I wonder if that may be a partial model.
Oh, that's interesting. Yeah, I'll have to look into that. Thank you very much.
Sorry, I have another question.
One more.
Bob, and you might have said this, I missed it, but in talking about the rise of violence, the threat of honor, did you find a class component in the violence? In other words, maybe I missed it, but
right.
Exactly who is the violence being directed to?
I don't think, what the book I'm citing is called American Homicide by Randy Roth. I think it came out last year, and he just studied, it's this massive sociological study. He doesn't separate it out by class. that I remember. So, but he says there's this definite, measurable, regional phenomenon going on after the revolution, and he's just studying homicide, convictions, charges, those sorts of things.
Most of the contemporary commentators emphasize how absolutely cross-class
Yeah,
it is.
yeah, and this is the next thing I would say, that I would say the violence that you're dealing with is it takes different styles in different classes, right? I think Wyatt Brown called some of the kind of more common sort of violence ungrammatical styles of violence, right? Biting, fighting, gouging, kind of thing. And then if you're an Episcopalian, you do it with pistols.
A T-shirt.
All right. Well, thank you again all for coming. Let's give our panelists and commentators